I spent 8 years burying a fire inside my chest, convincing myself that silence was survival. But on the night the Aether Duke's machine tore itself apart and I reached into the chaos without thinking, I learned that some flames refuse to stay hidden, and some secrets, once spoken, can never be taken back. The evening had begun like any other in my quiet existence as Lady Whitmore's companion. I had risen before dawn to prepare her morning tray, selecting the precise blend of tea she favored when her nerves were unsettled, arranging the toast and preserves in the pattern she demanded but never acknowledged. I had dressed her hair in the elaborate style she insisted upon, despite the fact that it flattered neither her face nor her years, and I had listened, as I listened every morning, to her complaints about the inadequacy of her modiste, the impertinence of her cook, the general decline of civilized society. The Baroness was a woman of faded beauty and endless grievances, widowed young and grown bitter in the decades since. Her husband had left her comfortable but not wealthy, respected but not admired, and she had spent the intervening years cultivating resentments the way other women cultivated roses. I had come into her service 3 years prior, recommended by a distant connection who owed my mother a debt she could never repay, and I had perfected the art of being invisible in her presence. Invisibility was my gift, my curse, my salvation. That morning, as I pinned the final curl into place, the post arrived with an invitation that would change everything. The Baroness read the heavy card with narrowed eyes, her thin lips pressing together in an expression I had learned to recognize as calculation. It was an invitation to a demonstration at Ashworth Manor, hosted by the Duke of Ashworth himself. The card promised a revolutionary exhibition of etheric technology, refreshments, and the pleasure of His Grace's company. I felt my heart stutter when I heard the name, though I kept my face carefully neutral. I had heard stories of the Duke of Ashworth all my life. They called him the Aether Duke, the most powerful wielder of that mysterious force in all the empire, a man who had bent the very fabric of nature to his will through science and discipline. He was said to be cold, brilliant, and utterly without sentiment, the sort of man who looked at human beings and saw only variables in an equation, the sort of man who might recognize what I was with a single glance. I hoped fervently that the Baroness would decline. She detested anything that smelled of progress or intellect, preferring gossip and cards to scientific exhibitions. Surely she would have no interest in watching machines hum and spark while men in spectacles droned about theories she did not understand. But I had underestimated her social ambition. She set the invitation down and announced that we would attend. Her tone brooked no argument, not that I would have dared to offer one. To be excluded from the Duke's events was to admit social irrelevance, and Lady Whitmore would sooner die than be forgotten. She might despise science, but she could not resist the opportunity to be seen at the most exclusive gathering of the season. The days leading up to the demonstration were torture of a particularly exquisite kind. I went through the motions of my duties, selecting gowns and arranging transportation and answering the Baroness's endless questions about matters I could not possibly know. But beneath my calm exterior, anxiety churned like a storm-tossed sea. I had not been near a true wielder since my childhood, since the days when my mother still lived and Dr. Crane still visited to check on my suppression. I did not know if the techniques that had fooled ordinary people for 8 years would withstand the scrutiny of a man who had made etheric power his life's work. I did not know if I could maintain my careful burial while standing in a room full of machines that called to the fire in my chest. I did not know if I was walking into salvation or destruction. The night of the demonstration arrived, cold and foggy, with a November wind that cut through clothing like a blade. I dressed the Baroness in her finest silk, adorned her with the jewels she had inherited from her mother, and arranged myself in the modest gray gown that marked my station. We climbed into the hired carriage, the Baroness complaining about the quality of the horses and the impertinence of the driver, and we set off through the darkened streets toward Ashworth Manor. The journey took nearly an hour, the carriage rattling over cobblestones and then smoother roads as we left the city behind. I sat in the corner, my hands folded in my lap, my breath shallow. Through the window, I watched the gaslights give way to darkness, then to the softer glow of country estates, then finally to a blaze of illumination that could only be our destination. Ashworth Manor rose from the mist like something from a fever dream, all Gothic spires and glowing windows. It was larger than I had imagined, a sprawling edifice of gray stone that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. Towers reached toward the clouded sky, their peaks lost in the fog. Windows blazed with light that was not quite natural, a cool blue radiance that I recognized instantly as etheric. The sight of it made my core stir uneasily, a flutter of warmth in my chest that I immediately suppressed. Carriages lined the curving drive, depositing passengers in silks and jewels who hurried toward the great doors. Footmen in immaculate livery stood at attention, their faces impassive, their movements precise. The Baroness descended from our carriage with all the dignity she could muster, and I followed in her wake, keeping my eyes lowered, my presence muted. The entrance hall stole my breath. It was vast, vaulted, lit by chandeliers that burned with that eerie blue light I had glimpsed from outside. The walls were lined with strange devices, glass and brass and copper, humming with contained power that I could feel in my bones. Display cases held artifacts I could not identify, mechanisms whose purposes I could only guess at. The air itself seemed charged, tingling against my skin, awakening sensations I had spent years learning to ignore. I pressed my hand to my sternum, a gesture that might have looked like nervousness, but was in fact a desperate attempt to quiet the fire that wanted to answer the call of so much etheric energy. I had done this 1,000 times before, in less challenging circumstances. I knew how to bury my core so deep that even I could barely sense it. 8 years of practice had made me an expert in self-suppression. But I had never been tested like this. The Baroness swept through the hall without a glance at the wonders around us, her attention fixed on the other guests, on who was present and who was absent, on who might be useful and who might be avoided. I followed her into the ballroom, where the demonstration would take place, and tried not to stare at the machine that dominated the center of the room. It was enormous, a construction of glass and metal and crystal that rose nearly to the ceiling. Black velvet draped its form, concealing its specifics, but even hidden it radiated power that made my suppressed core ache with longing. Around it, rows of gilded chairs had been arranged in a semicircle, and guests were taking their seats, their chatter filling the air with the music of privilege and complacency. The Baroness claimed a seat near the front, as was her right as a woman of her station, and I took my place standing behind her chair, as was mine as a woman of no station at all. From this position, I could see the entire room, the glittering guests, the looming machine, the servants moving silently along the walls. And then I saw him. Lord Sebastian Ashworth entered through a side door, and the room fell silent, as if someone had cut every throat at once. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps 30, with dark hair swept back from a face that seemed carved from marble. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, a mouth set in a line that might have been cruel or might have been merely controlled. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, pale and piercing, and they swept across the assembled crowd with an expression of barely concealed disdain. He wore black evening clothes impeccably tailored to his tall frame, unadorned by any ornament save a single ring on his right hand that caught the light with an inner glow. He moved with the controlled grace of a predator who knew he had no natural enemies, each step precise, each gesture economical. The air around him seemed to crackle with contained energy, and I realized with a shock that I could feel his core, a pulse of power so disciplined it was almost invisible. Almost, but not quite. I felt my own core pulse once, sharply, in response, and I dug my nails into my palms so hard I nearly drew blood. Something about him called to the fire inside me, a recognition I did not understand and did not want. It was as if his power knew mine, as if they were speaking to each other in a language I could not consciously hear. I looked away, fixing my gaze on the floor, counting the seconds until this evening would end, and I could return to the safety of my invisible life. The Duke took his place beside the veiled machine and began to speak. His voice was low and resonant, carrying easily through the vast room without any apparent effort. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being heard, to being obeyed, to having his every word treated as law. He spoke of Aether, that mysterious fifth element the ancients had theorized and modern science had finally harnessed. He explained that the philosophers of Greece had believed in 4 elements, earth and water and fire and air. But they had also spoken of a 5th essence, a quintessence that permeated all things and gave them life. For centuries, this ether had been dismissed as superstition, as wishful thinking, as the fantasy of minds too primitive to understand the true nature of the universe. But they had been wrong. Ether was real. It filled the spaces between atoms, flowed through the earth and sky, connected all living things in an invisible web of energy that most people never perceived. And some people, a very few, were born with the ability to sense this energy, to channel it, to shape it according to their will. These people were called wielders, and their cores, the organs that allowed them to interact with ether, were the most valuable and most dangerous gifts nature had ever bestowed. The Duke spoke of history, of wielders who had been burned as witches or worshipped as gods, of the slow scientific progress that had finally allowed humanity to understand what they were. He spoke of the present, of the registration system that tracked wielders from birth, of the training academies that taught them discipline, of the great houses and government agencies that employed their abilities for the advancement of civilization. He spoke of the future, of technologies that would transform the world, of machines that could harness etheric energy and make it available to all. And then he spoke of the machine before us. It was, he said, the culmination of 15 years of research. A device capable of drawing etheric energy from the atmosphere and converting it into power that could light entire cities, drive engines without coal, transform the very foundations of industry and progress. Tonight, he would demonstrate its capabilities. Tonight, the assembled guests would witness the dawn of a new age. An assistant in a white coat stepped forward and pulled away the velvet drape, revealing the machine in all its gleaming complexity. I had thought I was prepared. I was not. The device was beautiful in the way that storms are beautiful, all coiled potential and dangerous promise. A sphere of crystal sat at its center, suspended in a cage of brass and copper filaments that spiraled outward like the petals of some mechanical flower. The filaments connected to a series of amplifiers and converters, devices I recognized from half-remembered lessons my mother had given me before she taught me to hide what I was. Gauges and dials covered its surface, measuring forces I could not see but could feel, even through my suppression, humming in my bones like a second heartbeat. The audience gasped and applauded. The Duke acknowledged their appreciation with a slight nod, then raised his right hand. I saw the faint shimmer of etheric light dancing across his fingers, a controlled pulse of energy so precise it was almost invisible. He possessed a core, of course. Everyone knew that. The Ashworth family had produced wielders for generations, and Sebastian was said to be the most powerful of them all. But seeing it in action, feeling the controlled pulse of his power as he began to feed energy into the machine, made my own core ache with suppressed longing. This was what I could have been if circumstances had been different. This was what I had sacrificed to survive. The crystal sphere began to glow, first faintly, then with increasing intensity. Blue light filled the ballroom, casting strange shadows across the faces of the watching guests. The filaments hummed, the converters clicked, the gauges began to climb. The Duke's expression remained impassive, his concentration absolute, his hand steady as he channeled power into his creation. But I felt something the others did not. Something was wrong. It started as a flutter of unease, a dissonance in the etheric currents that set my teeth on edge. The machine was drawing energy, yes, but not in the smooth, controlled flow the Duke intended. There was a hunger to it, a greed, a pull that was growing stronger with each passing second. The crystal sphere was not just accepting power, it was demanding it, taking more than it was being given, reaching out into the ambient ether and drinking deep. I looked at the Duke's face and saw the first flicker of alarm in those cold eyes. He tried to withdraw his power, to cut off the feed, but the machine had developed a will of its own. The connection between his core and the device had become a conduit, and the energy was flowing in the wrong direction now, being pulled from him rather than pushed. His hand trembled. Sweat broke out on his pale forehead. The ring on his finger blazed with desperate light as he fought to regain control. The crystal sphere cracked. The sound was small, almost delicate, like the breaking of fine china. But I felt the significance of it in my bones, felt the containment begin to fail, felt the terrible potential that was about to be unleashed. The sphere cracked again, a web of fractures spreading across its surface. The blue glow became blinding. The hum became a shriek. People began to scream. Chairs overturned as guests scrambled to flee, their fine clothes tangling, their dignity forgotten in the primal need to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The doors were too far. The energy was building too fast. In seconds, it would reach critical mass and explode outward, a wave of raw etheric force that would kill everyone in its path. I stood frozen, watching the Duke fight to control a force that had grown beyond his grasp. His face was a mask of strain, his body rigid with effort, his core blazing so bright I could feel it even through my suppression. But it was not enough. The machine was too strong, too hungry, too far gone. He was going to fail. They were all going to die. The realization struck me with absolute clarity, and in that moment, everything changed. I did not think. I did not decide. I simply acted. My core ignited with a force I had never felt before, a fire that rose from the depths of my being and poured through my body like molten gold. 8 years of suppression shattered like the crystal sphere, and the power I had buried for so long erupted into the world with a fury that was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I thrust my hands forward, not knowing what I was doing, only knowing that I could not stand by and watch innocent people die. The energy that erupted from me was blinding, a shield of pure etheric force that expanded outward from my body and intercepted the killing wave just as it broke free of the machine. The collision was cataclysmic. 2 forces met in the center of that ballroom: the wild, destructive energy of the failing machine and the desperate protective power of my newly awakened core. For an instant that lasted an eternity, they fought, pushing against each other, neither willing to yield. I felt the strain in every fiber of my being, felt my core burning at the edge of its capacity, felt the terrible knowledge that if I faltered, if I failed, everyone in this room would die. I did not falter. I did not fail. With a final, desperate surge, I bent the killing wave back upon itself, collapsed it inward, contained it within a sphere of my own making. The energy fought like a living thing, writhing and shrieking, but I held it, compressed it, forced it to burn itself out in a controlled implosion that left nothing but fading light and the smell of ozone. The ballroom fell silent. The etheric glow faded from my hands. The machine sat dark and dead at the center of the room, its crystal sphere reduced to glittering powder, its copper filaments blackened and twisted. Around me, guests lay sprawled on the floor where they had fallen in their flight, staring at me with expressions of shock and fear and wonder. I stood there, trembling, as the magnitude of what I had just done crashed over me like a wave. I had revealed myself. After 8 years of hiding, 8 years of careful suppression, 8 years of denying what I was, I had shown every person in this room the truth. Lady Whitmore was the first to speak. Her voice was shrill, cutting through the silence like a blade. She demanded to know what I was, what I had done. She declared that I was her companion, just a companion, and that this was impossible. Her face was white with shock and something that looked very much like betrayal. I could not look at her. I could not look at anyone. I could only stand there, my whole body shaking as my carefully constructed world crumbled around me. Then I became aware of movement, and I looked up to see the Duke rising from where he had fallen. His evening clothes were singed, his face pale, but his eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. Whatever exhaustion he felt from his failed attempt to control the machine, whatever shock he experienced from nearly dying, was subsumed beneath a focus so complete it was almost painful to witness. He walked toward me, and the crowd parted before him, like water before a ship's prow. His steps were steady despite what he had just endured, his posture straight, his gaze unwavering. I wanted to run, but my legs would not obey. I wanted to speak, but my voice had abandoned me. He stopped an arm's length away, close enough that I could see the fine lines of strain around his eyes, the barely perceptible tremor in his hands. Close enough that I could feel his core, dimmed now but still present, reaching out toward mine with something that felt almost like recognition. He asked who I was. His voice was quiet, controlled, but I heard the undercurrent of something that might have been shock, or wonder, or fear. I told him my name was Eleanor Vance. I said I was no one, nothing, just a companion. My voice came out as a whisper, barely audible even in the silence of the ruined ballroom. His pale eyes narrowed, and when he spoke again, there was an edge to his voice that had not been there before. He said that no one did not save 40 lives with a single pulse of etheric energy. He said that nothing did not possess a core powerful enough to contain a cascade failure that should have killed everyone in this room. He asked again who I was, and this time the question carried the weight of command. Before I could answer, chaos descended. Guards rushed into the ballroom through every door, their uniforms marking them as the Duke's private security. Behind them came officials in the black coats of the Crown's etheric registry, their faces hard with the cold efficiency of men who had found exactly what they sought. Someone had summoned them, or perhaps they had already been present, watching from the shadows as they always watched. They took one look at me, at my hands still faintly glowing with residual energy, and their expressions hardened into predatory satisfaction. The senior official stepped forward, a man with gray hair and the eyes of a bureaucrat who had long ago learned to see people as problems to be solved. He announced that I was under arrest for violation of the Etheric Registration Act. He informed me that the penalty for concealing an unregistered core was imprisonment or conscription into Crown service. He gestured to his subordinates, and they started toward me with manacles already in their hands. I could not move. I could not think. After everything I had sacrificed, everything my mother had suffered to keep me safe, it was going to end like this, in chains and disgrace, my secret torn from me by my own foolish heroism. But the Duke stepped between me and the guards. His voice rang out, cold and absolute, filled with an authority that brooked no argument. He said that this woman was under his protection and his authority. He claimed her as a subject of investigation by right of his position as head of the Crown's Etheric Research Division. He stated that she would remain in his custody until he had determined the nature and extent of her abilities. He ordered them to touch her at their peril. The official's face reddened with anger. He protested that the law was clear, that an unregistered wielder was a matter for the registry, that the Duke had no right to interfere with Crown justice. The Duke did not raise his voice, but something in his tone made the official take an involuntary step backward. He said that he would take responsibility for her before the council if necessary. He said that her abilities were of potential value to the Crown, that the registry was not equipped to assess. He concluded that if the official wished to challenge his authority, he was welcome to do so. But he would do so in the proper channels and not in the Duke's own ballroom. A silent battle of wills played out between them, and I stood at its center, my fate hanging in the balance. The official's jaw worked, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He knew he was outranked, but the thought of backing down clearly galled him. In the end, practicality won over pride. The official announced that the matter would be referred to higher authorities. He declared that the council would be informed of this irregularity. He warned that the Duke would answer for any consequences that arose from his interference. Then he gestured sharply to his men, and they withdrew, their expressions promising that this was far from over. Lady Whitmore fled without a backward glance, eager to distance herself from the scandal I had become. Other guests followed in her wake, their earlier curiosity replaced by fear, their whispers already beginning to spread the story that would be all over London by morning. And I was left alone with the man who had just claimed me as his prisoner, his subject, his problem. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. He said that I would come with him. He stated that I would answer his questions. He warned me that I would not attempt to flee or to use my abilities without his permission. He concluded that if I cooperated, he would do what he could to ensure I was not executed. I wanted to protest, to demand to know what right he had to control my fate, to rail against the injustice of a world that punished me for being born with a gift I had never asked for. But I was exhausted, terrified, and alone. My mother was dead. The doctor who had helped us was dead. The life I had built, such as it was, had crumbled to nothing in a single evening. I had no one to turn to, no resources, no options. So I simply nodded, and I followed him out of that ruined ballroom into the cold November night. The carriage that awaited us was black and unmarked, drawn by 4 horses whose breath steamed in the icy air. The Duke handed me inside without ceremony, then climbed in after me and closed the door. The interior was dark, lit only by a single etheric lamp that cast pale blue shadows across his angular face. We rode in silence for what felt like hours, though it could not have been more than minutes. I stared out the window at the fog-shrouded grounds of his estate, watching the lights of the manor grow larger as we approached, trying to comprehend how thoroughly my life had been destroyed. I had spent 8 years perfecting the art of invisibility, and now I was the most visible person in London. The story would spread like wildfire. By morning, everyone would know about the mysterious woman with the unregistered core who had saved the Aether Duke's demonstration. I would be hunted, studied, used, or destroyed. There was no fourth option. The Duke spoke only once during that journey. His voice came out of the darkness like a blade sheathed in velvet, soft but dangerous. He said that my mother taught me to hide, that he could see the technique in how I suppressed my core. He said it was crude but effective, and that it must have been nearly impossible to maintain for so long. There was something in his voice that might have been reluctant respect, or perhaps merely professional curiosity. I did not answer. I did not trust myself to speak. Ashworth Manor received us like a living thing, doors opening before we reached them, lights igniting in hallways as we passed. The servants who appeared were silent and efficient, trained to invisibility in a way I recognized and envied. They took cloaks, brought refreshments, vanished without a word. The Duke led me through a maze of corridors, past rooms filled with strange devices and walls lined with books, past portraits of ancestors who watched with disapproving eyes, past windows that looked out on gardens lost in darkness. The deeper we went into the house, the older the architecture became, the stones grayer and colder, the shadows deeper. He stopped at last before a door of heavy oak, its surface carved with symbols I did not recognize. He produced a key from his waistcoat, a brass implement that glowed faintly in his hand. He told me that these would be my chambers. He explained that I was free to move within this wing of the house, but that I was not to enter the laboratory levels without escort. He mentioned that meals would be brought to me, and that clothing would be provided. He finished by saying that we would begin in the morning. I asked what exactly we would begin. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, thin and brittle, like paper ready to tear. His expression flickered, something almost human passing behind those cold eyes before vanishing into carefully maintained neutrality. He said that we would begin the process of understanding what I was and what I could become. Then he wished me good night, and he was gone, his footsteps fading into the darkness of the corridor, and I was alone in my gilded prison. The chambers were finer than any I had ever occupied, furnished with antiques that whispered of centuries past and hung with silk the color of deep twilight. A fire burned in the marble grate, crackling softly. Candles glowed on every surface, their light warm against the chill that seemed to seep from the very stones. A nightdress of soft cotton lay across the bed, next to a robe of blue velvet and slippers lined with fur. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching surfaces without feeling them, trying to convince myself that this was real. A writing desk stood near the window, supplied with paper and ink. A bookshelf held volumes whose titles I could not read in the flickering light. A door led to a bathing chamber with a copper tub and jars of scented oils. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the window and watched the first gray light of dawn creep across the grounds of Ashworth Manor, and I thought about all the choices that had led me to this moment. My mother's choice to hide me, my choice to stay hidden, my choice, in that ballroom, to reveal myself rather than let innocent people die. I did not regret that last choice. I could not. But I could not help wondering what would happen now, and whether the price of my compassion would be my freedom, my dignity, or my life. Morning came slowly, a gradual lightening of the sky that turned the fog from black to gray to white. I watched the sun rise, a pale disk behind the clouds, and felt nothing but exhaustion and dread. A soft knock at my door announced the arrival of a maid, a young woman with a round face and nervous eyes who carried a breakfast tray and could not quite meet my gaze. She set the tray on a table near the fire, then retreated to a wardrobe I had not noticed and began laying out garments. The clothes she selected were modest but well made, gowns in dark colors that would have suited my former role as a companion but seemed oddly out of place in this house of wonders. I realized with a start that someone had been thinking about me, planning for my presence, preparing for my stay. The thought was both comforting and unnerving. I ate without tasting, dressed without caring, and waited for the summons I knew would come. It arrived in the form of a footman, a tall man with an impassive face who led me through corridors I did not recognize to a part of the house I had not seen the night before. Here, the atmosphere changed. The carpets gave way to bare stone. The paintings gave way to diagrams and charts. The candles gave way to etheric lamps that hummed with contained energy. We stopped before a door that thrummed with power, a vibration I could feel in my teeth and bones. The laboratory, I realized, the heart of the Duke's work. The footman opened the door and stepped aside, and I walked into a room that stole my breath. It was vast, high-ceilinged, lit by skylights of frosted glass that diffused the weak November sun into an even, shadowless glow. Machines and devices filled every corner, covering every surface, hanging from the walls and ceiling like strange mechanical vines. Glass vessels bubbled with luminous liquids in colors I had no names for. Brass instruments measured forces I could not see. Copper wires connected everything in a web of power that made my newly awakened core sing with recognition. At the center of it all stood the Duke. He had shed his evening clothes for simpler attire, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, dark trousers, a leather apron stained with substances I did not recognize. His hair was slightly disordered, as if he had been running his hands through it, and there were shadows under his pale eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. He looked up as I entered, And once again I felt that strange pulse in my core, that recognition that frightened me more than anything else. His power reached out toward mine like a hand seeking another in the darkness, and I had to consciously resist the urge to reach back. He gestured to a chair near his workbench, a simple wooden seat that looked oddly domestic amid the arcane machinery. He told me to sit. He said he had questions for me. I sat. He asked, and slowly, haltingly, I told him my story. I told him about my mother, Margaret Vance, a widow who had loved a man with a weak core, a man who had died of a fever before I was born. I told him about my childhood, ordinary and uneventful, until the day I turned 7 and sneezed so hard that every candle in our small house ignited simultaneously. I told him about my mother's terror, her desperate attempts to understand what had happened, her realization that I had inherited something far stronger than my father's modest abilities. I told him about the stories she had heard, about children with powerful cores taken from their families, trained as weapons, used until they burned out. I told him about her determination that I would not share that fate. I told him about Dr. Silas Crane, the physician who had delivered me and who had agreed, for reasons I still did not fully understand, to help us. I told him about the falsified birth records that declared me core null, about the suppression techniques the doctor had taught my mother, about the endless hours of practice as she trained me to bury my fire so deep that no one would ever suspect its existence. I told him about my mother's death 3 years ago, from a wasting illness that had stolen her strength over months of slow decline. I remembered those final weeks with terrible clarity, the way she had grown thin and gray, the way her breath had rattled in her chest, the way she had gripped my hand with fingers that had lost all their strength. She had made me promise to keep hiding, to never reveal what I was, to survive at any cost. And then she had closed her eyes and slipped away, leaving me alone in a world that would destroy me if it knew the truth. Dr. Crane had come to the funeral, a small, private affair attended by no one else. He had stood beside me at the graveside, his weathered face solemn, and he had told me that my mother had been the bravest woman he had ever known. He had offered to help me, to provide references that would allow me to find respectable work, but he had also warned me that his own protection could only extend so far. He was old, he said, and his influence was waning. I would need to be careful. I would need to be invisible. 6 months after my mother's death, Dr. Crane himself had died. A carriage accident, they said, though I had always wondered if there was more to the story. He had known too many secrets, helped too many people hide what they were. Perhaps someone had decided he was a liability. Or perhaps it was simply fate, the cruel randomness of a universe that did not care about the plans of mortals. With his death, I lost my last connection to the life I had lived before. I became truly alone, adrift in a world that saw me as nothing more than a servant, a shadow, a woman without history or future. I told Sebastian all of this, watching his face for signs of judgment or pity. I found neither. Instead, I saw something that might have been recognition, the understanding of one orphan for another, one survivor for another. I told him about finding work as a companion, about the agency that had placed me with Lady Whitmore, about learning to be invisible in a world that was determined to overlook me. I told him about the lonely years of hiding in plain sight, about the constant vigilance, about the fear that never quite faded, no matter how many days passed without incident. The Duke listened without interrupting, his pale eyes never leaving my face. His expression revealed nothing, but I sensed something shifting behind that marble facade, some calculation or assessment that I could not read. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his words changed everything I thought I knew about myself. He said that my core was exceptional. He said it was not just powerful, but resonant, capable of harmonizing with etheric frequencies in ways he had never observed. He told me that the cascade failure at his demonstration should have killed everyone in that ballroom. He said I had contained energy equivalent to a lightning strike with nothing but instinct and raw will. He paused, and something shifted in his expression. A crack in the marble facade that revealed something almost like wonder. He said he had never seen anything like me. I did not know how to respond. All my life, my power had been a curse, something to be hidden and suppressed and denied. To hear it described as exceptional, remarkable, unprecedented, felt like hearing praise in a language I did not speak. But the Duke was not finished. He said he needed to understand the nature of my abilities. He explained that he needed to test them, measure them, document them. He stated that only then could he make a case to the Crown for leniency. He warned that without evidence that my power could be controlled and directed toward useful ends, the registry would demand my imprisonment or worse. He asked if I understood. He asked if I would cooperate. I looked into his cold eyes and saw something I had not expected to find: uncertainty. This man, this legend, this master of etheric science did not know what to make of me. I was a puzzle he could not solve, a variable that did not fit his equations. And beneath his clinical detachment, I sensed a curiosity that bordered on obsession. I told him that I would cooperate. What choice did I have? And so began my days as the Duke's subject. The tests were exhausting, invasive, sometimes painful. He measured the output of my core with instruments that hummed and clicked and whirred, recording data in ledgers whose pages were already filled with dense calculations. Each morning, I would enter the laboratory to find new devices arranged on his workbench, new experiments designed to probe the depths of my abilities. He tested my precision, asking me to light individual candles in a row without affecting the others. He tested my power, measuring the energy I could channel through increasingly complex mechanisms. He tested my endurance, pushing me to maintain etheric output for minutes, then hours, noting exactly when my strength began to flag. There were instruments that measured the frequency of my core's vibration, devices that recorded the color and intensity of the light I produced, mechanisms that analyzed the way my energy interacted with various materials. He took samples of my blood, examined my eyes with strange lenses, measured my pulse before and after exertion. I submitted to all of it, having no choice, but with each passing day, my resentment grew. He asked me to channel energy through various devices, noting the results with meticulous precision. He pushed me to the limits of my abilities and then pushed further, always wanting to know what lay beyond the boundaries I had carefully maintained for so long. One afternoon, after a particularly demanding session that had left me trembling with exhaustion, I finally found my voice. I asked him if he ever considered that I might be more than a collection of measurements. I asked if he ever wondered what it felt like to be poked and prodded like an animal in a menagerie. I asked if he had forgotten that I was a person, not a mechanism to be dismantled and studied. He looked at me for a long moment, his pale eyes unreadable. Then he did something I had not expected. He apologized. He said he had been so focused on understanding my abilities that he had lost sight of the person who possessed them. He admitted that he was not good at seeing people, that he had spent so long thinking of the world in terms of forces and equations, that he sometimes forgot that human beings were not simply variables to be measured. He said he would try to do better. It was not much of an apology, but it was something. After that, the tenor of our sessions began to change. He still tested me, still measured and recorded and analyzed, but he also began to explain what he was doing and why, treating me as a participant rather than a subject. He asked for my observations, my feelings, my insights. He listened when I spoke, and sometimes he even adjusted his methods based on what I told him. I hated it at first. I hated being treated like a specimen, a thing to be studied rather than a person to be known. I hated the way he looked at me with those analytical eyes, cataloging my responses as if I were one of his machines. Most of all, I hated the way my body responded to his presence, the way my core seemed to reach toward him whenever he was near, as if recognizing a kindred spirit despite my conscious resistance. But as the days passed, something began to change. It started with small things. A cup of tea that appeared at my elbow during a particularly grueling session, brought not by a servant, but by the Duke himself, his hands still stained with the residue of some experiment. A question about my comfort, asked with what might have been genuine concern when I grew pale during a difficult test. A pause in the proceedings when I stumbled with exhaustion, followed by a gruff instruction to rest. He was not kind exactly. Kindness seemed foreign to his nature, as if it were a language he had once spoken but had long since forgotten. But he was not cruel either, and as I observed him more closely, I began to see the man behind the legend. Lord Sebastian Ashworth was brilliant, yes, his mind a precision instrument capable of cutting through complexity like a scalpel through flesh. But his brilliance was tinged with something darker. I saw it in the way he worked himself to the point of collapse, eating rarely and sleeping less, driving himself with a ferocity that seemed almost punitive. I saw it in the haunted look that sometimes crossed his face when he thought no one was watching, a grief so profound it seemed to hollow him from within. I saw it in the locked door at the end of the laboratory corridor, a door he never opened and never discussed, though I caught him standing before it more than once, his hand pressed flat against the wood, his expression raw with anguish. I learned the truth from Lady Isolde, his mother, who summoned me to tea one afternoon in the formal parlor. The parlor was a masterpiece of restraint, all pale silks and delicate furniture, designed to showcase wealth without vulgarity. Lady Isolde sat at its center like a spider in a particularly elegant web, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her black dress immaculate, her posture so rigid it seemed carved from marble. She was a formidable woman, beautiful in the cold way of winter landscapes, with the Duke's pale eyes and none of his hidden depths. She looked at me as though I were something unpleasant she had found on the sole of her shoe, and her questions were barbed with barely concealed disdain. She wanted to know who my people were. She wanted to know my father's profession, my mother's maiden name, the circumstances of my birth and upbringing. She wanted to know how I had the audacity to appear in her house as her son's guest when I was clearly nothing more than a common criminal with ideas above my station. I answered her questions as best I could, maintaining a composure I did not feel. I had faced disapproval before, from Lady Whitmore and from countless others who saw a companion as barely better than a servant. But Lady Isolde's contempt was of a different order, cold and absolute, the disdain of a woman who had spent her entire life believing that birth determined worth. When she finally exhausted her supply of venom, she delivered the blow she had clearly been saving for last. She told me about Edmund. Edmund had been Sebastian's younger brother, she explained, born with a core even stronger than the Duke's own. But Edmund had been wild, reckless, unable or unwilling to submit to the discipline that etheric power demanded. He had wanted to push boundaries, to experiment with forces that more cautious minds considered too dangerous to touch. He had believed that his strength made him invincible, that the rules that governed lesser wielders did not apply to him. 3 years ago, Edmund had attempted an experiment without Sebastian's knowledge or approval. The details were unclear, Lady Isolde said, her voice carefully neutral despite the pain that flickered in her eyes. Something to do with amplification, with pushing the limits of what a core could contain. The specifics did not matter. What mattered was the result. Something had gone catastrophically wrong. Edmund had been killed, his body found in the wreckage of his secret laboratory, his core burned out like a candle flame, extinguished by a sudden gust. Sebastian had been in London when it happened, attending to business at the registry. By the time he received word and returned, there was nothing left but ashes and silence. Lady Isolde's voice was cold as she delivered this information, but I saw the grief beneath the frost. She had lost one son to hubris, and watched the other wall himself off from human connection. She blamed the ether, blamed science, blamed everyone and everything except the forces of nature that had claimed her child. And she blamed Sebastian most of all, for not watching Edmund more closely, for not preventing the experiment, for surviving when her favorite son had not. She did not say these last accusations aloud, but I heard them nonetheless, in the silences between her words, in the ice of her gaze when she looked at me. I left that tea with my mind reeling. Everything I thought I knew about the Duke had shifted, revealing hidden depths I had not suspected. His obsession with control, his clinical detachment, his relentless pursuit of understanding, they were not merely personality traits, but armor, built to protect a wound that had never healed. I found myself thinking about him differently after that. When he pushed me to demonstrate my abilities, I saw not cruelty, but fear, the fear of a man who had watched power destroy someone he loved. When he kept his distance, maintaining the cold formality of scientist and subject, I understood it was protection, for himself as much as for me. And when our eyes met across the laboratory, and I felt that strange pulse of recognition, I began to wonder if what I sensed in him was not analysis, but longing, a longing for connection he had forbidden himself to feel. The weeks passed, and winter settled over Ashworth Manor like a shroud. Snow blanketed the grounds, turning the gardens into fields of white, muffling sound, making the world feel small and enclosed. The days grew short, and the long nights were lit by the eerie blue glow of etheric lamps that never flickered or dimmed. My chambers became familiar, even comfortable. I learned the creaks of the floorboards, the particular warmth of the fire in the grate, the way the light fell through the windows at different times of day. The servants treated me with cautious respect, unsure of my status but unwilling to offend someone under the Duke's protection. And my sessions with Sebastian, as I had begun to think of him in the privacy of my mind, evolved into something I had not anticipated. He began to teach me. At first, it was purely practical. He showed me how to direct my energy with precision, how to modulate my output, how to draw on ambient ether to supplement my own reserves. He explained the theory behind the techniques, treating me as a student rather than a specimen. He drew diagrams, recommended readings, answered my questions with a patience that surprised us both. And I discovered, to my surprise, that I was a quick learner. More than quick. The abilities I had suppressed for so long emerged with startling force once I stopped fighting them. Exercises that should have taken weeks to master took me days. Feats that Sebastian considered advanced came to me with an ease that clearly unsettled him. The more I learned, the more my power grew, and the more his carefully maintained composure began to crack. One evening, after a particularly successful session in which I had managed to light every lamp in the laboratory with a single pulse of controlled energy, he stood looking at me with an expression I could not read. He said that I was remarkable. His voice was quiet, almost reluctant. He said that in all his years of study, he had never encountered a core like mine. He speculated that I might be the most powerful natural wielder alive. I did not know how to respond. Praise from him felt like sunlight after a long darkness, warming parts of me I had thought frozen beyond recovery. But it also frightened me, because with each passing day, I was becoming more and more entangled in this strange life, and with the strange man who had made it possible. That night, I could not sleep. I wrapped myself in a shawl and wandered the corridors of the private wing, seeking something I could not name. The house was quiet, the servants retired, the only sounds the distant ticking of clocks and the soft hiss of etheric lamps. I found myself, almost without meaning to, standing before the locked door at the end of the laboratory corridor. The door was ajar. I should have walked away. I should have returned to my chambers and pretended I had seen nothing. But curiosity, that fatal flaw that had driven Eve to the apple and Pandora to the box, drew me forward. I pushed the door open and stepped into the room beyond. It was a memorial. The walls were lined with photographs, sketches, personal effects. A young man's face smiled from every surface, a face that shared Sebastian's angular features, but softened by youth and vitality. He had been handsome, I realized, with laughing eyes and a grin that suggested mischief. Books lay open on a desk, annotated in handwriting I did not recognize, their pages covered with equations and theories. A coat hung on a stand, as if waiting for its owner to return. Edmund. This was Edmund's room, preserved exactly as he had left it. I moved through the space like a ghost, afraid to touch anything, afraid to disturb the careful arrangement that spoke of grief preserved in amber. On the desk, I found a journal, its pages filled with cramped writing and elaborate drawings. I did not read it. It felt too much like violation, but I stood looking at it for a long moment, trying to understand the man who had written it and the brother who had kept it. A sound behind me made me spin around, my heart hammering. The Duke stood in the doorway, his face a mask of fury and pain. He demanded to know what I was doing there. His voice was ice and fire, and I flinched from its force. The careful control he always maintained had shattered, and what remained was raw emotion, grief and anger, and something that looked almost like fear. I apologized. I told him the door was open, that I had not meant to intrude. My voice shook, and I could not make it steady. For a long moment, he simply stared at me, his chest heaving, his hands clenched at his sides. I thought he might strike me, or dismiss me, or cast me out into the snow to fend for myself. But instead, something in him seemed to break, and he slumped against the doorframe, suddenly looking less like a duke and more like a man carrying a burden too heavy to bear. He said Edmund had been brilliant. He said Edmund had been reckless. He said he had tried to control him, to teach him discipline, to make him understand the dangers of unchecked power. But Edmund had not listened. Edmund had been convinced that rules were for lesser minds, that his strength made him immune to consequence. The night of the experiment, Sebastian had been in London, attending a meeting at the registry that he had thought more important than his brother's latest project. By the time he received word and returned, riding through the night in a desperate race against hope, there was nothing left. Nothing but ashes and silence and a charred ruin where a laboratory had stood. His voice broke on the last word, and I saw tears glinting in his pale eyes. I did not think. I simply moved. I crossed the distance between us and placed my hand on his arm, a gesture of comfort that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. I told him I was sorry. I said it was not his fault. I said that Edmund had made his own choices, and Sebastian could not have stopped him any more than he could have stopped the tide. I said that loving someone did not mean you could save them from themselves. He looked at my hand on his arm, then at my face. And in his eyes, I saw something shift, some wall crumble, some barrier fall. He said that everyone told him it was not his fault. He said he knew they were right, intellectually, in the part of his mind that dealt in logic and reason. He confessed he could not stop believing it was. He said that every time he closed his eyes, he saw Edmund's face, heard Edmund's voice, felt the absence where his brother used to be. I told him I understood. I said that I had spent 8 years blaming myself for my mother's death, convinced that if I had been normal, if I had not been born with this curse, she would have lived longer, worried less, suffered less. I shared that I knew the weight of guilt that logic could not touch. We stood there in the doorway of Edmund's memorial, 2 broken people holding each other's pain. And when he raised his hand to cover mine, I felt my core pulse once, gently, in recognition of something I had never allowed myself to feel. He said my name, Eleanor. Just that, nothing more. But the way he said it, like a question and an answer and a prayer, changed everything. I do not know which of us moved first. I only know that suddenly his arms were around me and my face was pressed against his chest, and we were holding each other with a desperation that had nothing to do with science or power or duty. He smelled of ether and copper and something uniquely his own, and his heart beat beneath my ear in a rhythm that matched my own. We did not kiss that night. We did not speak of what had happened. But when I finally returned to my chambers, the sky was beginning to lighten, and I knew that everything had changed. The Duke, The man I had thought incapable of feeling, the cold scientist who treated me as a specimen, was as lost and lonely as I was. And somewhere in the midst of our strange arrangement, we had begun to find something in each other that we had both thought forever beyond our reach. The days that followed were a kind of exquisite torture. We continued our sessions in the laboratory, but now every touch was charged with meaning, every glance heavy with unspoken words. He would adjust my hands to demonstrate a technique, and his fingers would linger on my skin longer than necessary. I would complete an exercise, and I would look up to find him watching me with an intensity that made my breath catch. We did not speak of what had passed between us in Edmund's room, but it hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, impossible to dispel. He brought me books from his personal library, volumes on etheric theory and Victorian poetry alike. I discovered that he loved Tennyson, that he could recite whole passages from memory, that his cold exterior concealed a romantic heart he had long since learned to hide. He asked me questions about my past, my hopes, my fears, and listened to my answers with an attention that made me feel seen for the first time in my life. He showed me the gardens in the snow, vast expanses of white, broken by the dark shapes of dormant trees and the frozen curves of fountains. He showed me the greenhouse where tropical flowers bloomed despite the cold, orchids and lilies and roses in every color, their scent thick and sweet in the humid air. He showed me the music room where he sometimes played the piano in the dark, his fingers moving across the keys with a grace that seemed at odds with his scientific precision. And I fell in love with him, hopelessly, helplessly, against all reason and propriety. I fell in love with his brilliance and his pain, his strength and his vulnerability, his cold exterior and his hidden warmth. I fell in love with the way he looked at me when he thought I was not watching, as if I were a miracle he could not quite believe. But our fragile peace was not to last. The letter arrived on a gray morning in early December, bearing the seal of the crown. Sebastian read it in silence, his face going pale, then handed it to me without a word. I was summoned to appear before the Royal Etheric Council in 1 week's time. My abilities would be assessed, my history examined, my fate decided. The Duke's protection could only extend so far, and there were those on the council who viewed unregistered cores as threats to be eliminated, not resources to be cultivated. I looked up from the letter to find him watching me, his expression unreadable. I asked what would happen. He said he did not know. He admitted that the council was divided, that some members supported his research and saw value in what I represented, while others feared anything that could not be controlled, anything that challenged the careful order they had built. He revealed that there were factions within the government who would see me dead rather than risk my power falling into the wrong hands or, worse, inspiring others to hide their cores as I had hidden mine. I asked him what he thought should happen. He was silent for a long moment, his pale eyes searching my face as if looking for something he was not sure he would find. Then he spoke, and his words struck me with the force of revelation. He said that I should decide my own fate. He declared that I was not a thing to be disposed of by committee, not a weapon to be wielded by the crown. He affirmed that I was a person with rights and choices, regardless of what the law said, regardless of what society believed. His words echoed in the quiet room, and I felt tears prick at my eyes. In all my life, no one had ever suggested that I had the right to choose my own destiny. My mother had chosen to hide me. Society had chosen to persecute me. Sebastian himself had chosen to protect me. But no one had ever asked what I wanted. I told him I did not know what I wanted. I confessed that I had spent so long trying to survive that I had never learned how to live. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body through the cold air, close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his pale eyes. He said that was something we had in common. The week before the council hearing was the most intense of my life. Sebastian pushed me harder than ever, teaching me techniques I had never imagined, showing me the full extent of my capabilities. But he also showed me something else: how to present myself, how to speak to men of power, how to demonstrate strength without appearing threatening. We practiced in the ballroom, that same room where my secret had been revealed, now restored to its former glory, but forever changed in my memory. Sebastian played the part of the council members, throwing difficult questions at me, challenging my composure, testing my ability to remain calm under pressure. He taught me to stand with my shoulders back and my chin raised, projecting confidence even when I felt none. He taught me to speak clearly and without apology, to answer questions directly without being defensive. He taught me to demonstrate my abilities in ways that appeared controlled and purposeful, never wild or dangerous, and he warned me about the men I would face. Lord Blackwood was the head of the council, a man of 70 who had wielded power in the registry for decades. He distrusted anything he could not control and saw unregistered wielders as threats to the stability of the realm. He would vote against me no matter what I said or did. Sir Marcus Whitfield was Blackwood's chief ally, a former military man who believed that wielders should serve the crown without question or choice. He had advocated for years for mandatory conscription of all corps bearers, and he would see my case as evidence that registration alone was not sufficient, but there were others who might be persuaded. Lord Ashworth himself sat on the council, of course, and his vote was certain. Dr. Helena Marsh was a scientist who valued knowledge above politics, and she might be swayed by evidence of my potential. Lord Pemberton was a pragmatist who cared more about outcomes than principles, and if Sebastian could demonstrate my usefulness, he might support leniency. The politics of the council were Byzantine and treacherous, and I felt hopelessly inadequate to navigate them. But Sebastian had spent years learning these waters, and he guided me through them with patient determination. 3 days before the hearing, we received a visitor. He arrived unannounced, a small man in a dark coat with the pinched face of someone who had spent too many years in cramped offices breathing stale air. He introduced himself as Mr. Cornelius Finch, special investigator for the registry, and he said he had some questions about my history. Sebastian was furious, but he could not refuse to admit a registry official. Mr. Finch spent 2 hours interrogating me about my past, my mother, Dr. Crane, every detail of the suppression techniques I had used. His questions were probing and hostile, designed to catch me in contradictions, to find evidence of crimes beyond the concealment I had already admitted. I answered as best I could, maintaining my composure despite the sweat that slicked my palms and the fear that churned in my stomach. When he finally left, I collapsed into a chair, trembling. Sebastian paced the room like a caged lion, his face dark with anger. He said that Finch was Blackwood's creature, sent to find ammunition that could be used against me at the hearing. He said we needed to be more careful, to anticipate every possible attack. That night, I barely slept. He was preparing me not just to survive the hearing, but to triumph. And in the evenings, when the servants had retired and the manor was quiet, we sat together in the library and talked. We spoke of our pasts, our losses, our dreams. We spoke of science and philosophy, of poetry and music. We spoke of everything except the one thing that hung between us, the connection that had grown too powerful to ignore. On the night before my hearing, I could no longer bear the silence. I found him in the music room, sitting at the piano in the dark. He was not playing, just sitting there with his hands on the keys, staring at nothing. The only light came from the windows, where the moon cast silver shadows across the floor. I crossed the room and sat beside him on the bench, close enough that our shoulders touched. He did not move away. I told him I was afraid. I said that tomorrow I might lose everything. I confessed that I might never see him again. He turned to look at me, and in the dim light, his pale eyes were luminous. He said he would not let that happen. He promised he would protect me, no matter the cost. He vowed he would find a way. I asked why it mattered so much to him. He did not answer with words. Instead, he raised his hand and touched my face, his fingers tracing the line of my cheekbone with a gentleness that made me tremble. And then he leaned in and kissed me, soft and slow and achingly tender. It was not a kiss of passion, though passion was there, banked like coals waiting to ignite. It was a kiss of promise, of hope, of something neither of us had dared to name. When we finally drew apart, my heart was pounding and my eyes were wet with tears. He said my name again, Eleanor, and then he said that he loved me. He confessed that he had loved me from the moment I walked into his ruined ballroom and saved everyone with nothing but the fire in my heart. He admitted he had tried to resist, to maintain his distance, to protect us both from an attachment that could only end in disaster. But he could not. He said I had broken through every wall he had ever built, and he did not want to rebuild them. I told him I loved him too. I said it was terrifying and wonderful and impossible. I said I did not know what tomorrow would bring, but whatever happened, I wanted him to know that he had given me something I thought I had lost forever, the belief that I was worthy of being loved. We sat there in the darkness, our hands intertwined, until the first light of dawn began to seep through the windows. Then, without another word, we rose and went to face the future. The Royal Etheric Council met in a grand chamber in the heart of London, a room of dark wood and heavy drapes that seemed designed to intimidate. High windows let in gray light that did nothing to dispel the gloom. Portraits of past council members looked down from the walls, their expressions uniformly severe. I stood at the center of the chamber, facing a raised dais where a dozen men sat in judgment. They wore the black robes of their office, their faces stern and impassive, their eyes cold with the dispassion of those who had long since learned to see people as cases rather than individuals. Sebastian stood beside me, his presence a shield against the hostile stares. He had dressed with care this morning, in clothes that spoke of wealth and authority, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. But I could feel the tension in him, the fear he hid behind his perfect composure. He was risking everything for me, his reputation, his position, his future. If the council ruled against us, he would share in my disgrace. The hearing was brutal. They questioned me about my past, my mother, the doctor who had helped us hide. They demanded to know every detail of my concealment, every lie I had told, every falsified record. They accused me of treason, of deception, of being a threat to national security. They dismissed my explanation that I had only wanted to live a normal life, that I had never sought to use my power against anyone. Lord Blackwood led the assault, his voice dripping with contempt as he catalogued my crimes. He spoke of the sanctity of the registration system, of the dangers posed by wielders who operated outside the law. He painted me as a threat to everything the council had built, a wolf in sheep's clothing who had deceived honest citizens for years. Sir Marcus Whitfield was even worse. He suggested that my actions proved I could not be trusted, that I had demonstrated a willingness to break any rule that inconvenienced me. He argued that the only safe course was to neutralize my abilities permanently, a process that existed in theory but had never been attempted on a wielder of my strength. The word neutralize hung in the air like a death sentence, and I felt the blood drain from my face. But Dr. Marsh intervened. She said that my abilities were extraordinary, that they represented a unique opportunity for scientific advancement. She argued that destroying what could not be replicated would be an act of intellectual barbarism. Lord Pemberton agreed, though his reasoning was more pragmatic. He noted that I had used my power to save lives, not take them. He suggested that with proper training and oversight, I could become a valuable asset to the Crown. The council debated for what felt like hours, their voices rising and falling, their arguments growing heated. I stood at the center of it all, my fate the prize in a game I did not fully understand. And then they tested me. The tests were far more severe than anything Sebastian had put me through. They pushed me to the limits of my endurance, forcing me to demonstrate abilities I had only just learned to control. They wanted to see me fail, I realized. They wanted proof that I was dangerous, uncontrollable, a threat that needed to be neutralized. But I did not fail. Every technique Sebastian had taught me, every lesson I had learned, every ounce of strength I possessed, I poured into those tests. I showed them precision and control. I showed them power tempered by discipline. I showed them a woman who was not a weapon, but a person, capable of wielding extraordinary abilities with wisdom and restraint. When the tests were finished, I stood before the council, exhausted but unbowed. Sebastian spoke then, his voice ringing through the chamber with the authority of his name and his position. He told them that I was the most remarkable wielder he had ever encountered. He declared that my abilities, properly directed, could advance etheric science by decades. He argued that to destroy me out of fear would be to waste an invaluable resource and commit an unconscionable injustice. He spoke of potential and progress, of the future I could help build if given the chance. He spoke of mercy and wisdom, of the difference between justice and cruelty. He spoke with a passion I had never heard from him before, a fire that matched the one burning in my own chest. The council deliberated for hours. I waited in an antechamber with Sebastian, too exhausted to speak, too anxious to rest. He held my hand through the long silence, and his presence was the only thing that kept me from despair. When the verdict finally came, it was not what I had expected. The council agreed that I would not be imprisoned or executed. Instead, I would be registered as an etheric wielder under the Duke's supervision, permitted to continue my training and eventually to serve the crown in a capacity befitting my abilities. It was not freedom, not exactly, but it was far better than I had dared to hope. I looked at Sebastian, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw him smile. The journey back to Ashworth Manor felt different from the first time I had made it, months ago in chains and terror. Now I sat beside Sebastian in the carriage, our hands clasped between us, watching the winter landscape roll past the frosted windows. I asked what would happen now. He said that I would continue my training. He explained that I would learn to master my abilities fully, to understand the depths of my power and the breadth of my potential. He said that eventually, when I was ready, I would take my place in the world as a wielder of unparalleled strength. I asked if I would have to leave Ashworth Manor. He looked at me, and his pale eyes were soft. He said that would depend on me. He explained that the manor would always be open to me, for as long as I wished to stay. He confessed that he hoped I would choose to remain, not as his subject or his student, but as something more. I asked what he meant by something more. He lifted my hand to his lips and kissed my knuckles, a gesture so tender it made my breath catch. He said he meant as his partner, his equal. He said he meant as his wife, if I would have him. For a moment, I could not speak. The proposal was so unexpected, so far beyond anything I had imagined, that my mind simply stopped. I had prepared myself for prison, for death, for a lifetime of servitude. I had not prepared myself for love. I thought of all the obstacles that stood between us, the difference in our stations, the scandal that would surely follow. The fact that I was a registered anomaly, a woman with a dangerous power, a target for those who would use me or destroy me. But I also thought of the way he looked at me, as if I were the answer to a question he had been asking all his life. I thought of the nights we had spent talking in the library, the way his walls had crumbled, the tenderness he had shown me in his grief and his hope. I thought of the future stretching before me, a future that for the first time held the promise of love and purpose and belonging. I said yes. The word came out as a whisper, but he heard it. He pulled me into his arms and kissed me, and this time there was nothing restrained about it. It was a kiss of passion and promise, of two souls finally acknowledging the bond that had formed between them. When we drew apart, we were both breathless. He said there would be challenges. He warned that society would talk. He said there were enemies who would try to use our connection against us. I told him I knew. I said I did not care. I declared that I had spent my whole life hiding from who I was, and I was done hiding. I wanted to face the future openly, honestly, with him by my side. His smile in that moment was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The months that followed were not easy. Lady Isolde fought our engagement with every weapon at her disposal, horrified by the prospect of her son marrying a common nobody with a criminal past. She threatened, she pleaded, she raged. She called me names that I will not repeat and accused me of manipulations I had never conceived. When none of that worked, she retreated into a cold silence that was somehow worse than her anger. Society whispered and speculated, eager to tear us apart. The scandal of our engagement was the talk of every drawing room, the subject of every gossip column. I was called an adventuress, a fortune hunter, a seductress who had bewitched the Duke with unnatural powers. Sebastian was called a fool, a traitor to his class, a man who had lost his mind to an unworthy woman. And there were darker threats, too. Anonymous letters arrived at the manor, warning me to leave the Duke or face consequences. Someone tried to discredit me to the council, spreading rumors that I had used my abilities to manipulate Sebastian's mind. One night, returning from the opera, our carriage was set upon by masked men who fled only when Sebastian unleashed a burst of etheric power that lit up the street like lightning. We never discovered who was behind the attack, though we had our suspicions. There were those who feared what I represented, an unregistered wielder who had escaped punishment, a precedent that threatened the careful control the registry had built over decades. There were those who coveted Sebastian's position, his wealth, his influence, and saw me as a way to destroy him. There were those who simply hated us for daring to defy the expectations of our stations. But through it all, Sebastian stood beside me. He defended me to his mother, to society, to anyone who dared to question my worth. He held me when the threats overwhelmed me and helped me find my courage when I faltered. He taught me that love was not just feeling, but action, not just words, but choices made day after day in the face of every obstacle. And I grew stronger, not just in my abilities, though those continued to expand in ways that astonished even Sebastian. I grew stronger in myself, in my sense of who I was and what I deserved. I was no longer the frightened girl who hid in corners, praying to be overlooked. I was a woman with power and purpose, loved and loving, ready to claim my place in the world. We were married in the spring, in the chapel at Ashworth Manor. It was a small ceremony, attended only by those who truly mattered. Lady Isolde was absent, still refusing to accept me, but I had made my peace with that. Some wounds take longer to heal, and some barriers are never fully broken. What mattered was that Sebastian was there, waiting for me at the altar, his pale eyes bright with tears he would never admit to shedding. The vows we spoke were the traditional ones, but they carried a weight of meaning that no one else could fully understand. We had found each other through tragedy and terror, through secrets and storms. We had been tested in ways that would have broken lesser souls. And we had emerged not unscathed, but unbowed, bound together by something stronger than circumstance. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, Sebastian kissed me with a tenderness that made my heart ache. And I knew, in that moment, that whatever the future held, we would face it together. The years that followed were the fullest of my life. I worked alongside Sebastian in his research, contributing insights and abilities that helped him achieve breakthroughs he had only dreamed of. Together, we developed new applications for etheric technology that transformed industry, medicine, transportation. We trained other wielders, teaching them the discipline and wisdom that had taken me so long to learn. We built a life together in Ashworth Manor, filling its cold halls with warmth and laughter and love. We had children, 2 daughters and a son, all born with cores of their own. Watching them discover their abilities, helping them learn to control their gifts, was both terrifying and wonderful. I saw in them echoes of myself at their age, the fear and confusion of being different, and I vowed that they would never have to hide, as I had hidden. They would grow up knowing who they were and what they could become. Lady Isolde eventually relented, worn down by time and the undeniable evidence of my devotion to her son. She never fully accepted me, but she came to tolerate my presence, and in her last years she even showed me moments of grudging respect. When she died, Sebastian mourned her genuinely, and I stood beside him as I always had, a steady presence in his grief. And Edmund was not forgotten. Each year, on the anniversary of his death, we visited his memorial room together. Sebastian would tell stories about his brother, the bright and reckless boy he had loved and lost. I would listen and hold his hand and remind him that grief and guilt are not the same thing, that loving someone does not mean you could have saved them. The world changed around us, as worlds always do. Etheric technology spread across the globe, transforming society in ways both wondrous and troubling. There were new challenges, new conflicts, new questions about the proper use of powers that had once been the province of a privileged few. But Sebastian and I faced them together, as partners and equals, each drawing strength from the other. I look back now on the frightened girl I once was, the one who buried her fire and prayed for invisibility, and I barely recognize her. The journey from that girl to the woman I have become has been long and difficult, marked by pain and loss and moments of despair. But it has also been marked by love, by growth, by the discovery that the things we fear most about ourselves can become our greatest strengths. I hid my ether core for 8 years, convinced that suppression was survival. But on the night I chose to reveal myself, to save strangers I had never met at the cost of everything I had built, I learned a truth that has guided me ever since. Our gifts are not given to us so that we can hide them away. They are given to us so that we can use them to help others, to change the world, to become the people we were always meant to be. The fire inside me burned in secret for so long, but now it burns openly, a beacon in the darkness, a light that has illuminated my path through every shadow, and I would not have it any other way. Sebastian is beside me now, as he has been for so many years, his hair silver at the temples, his eyes still as piercing as the day we met. We sit in the library where we spent so many evenings in those first fragile months, surrounded by books and memories and the artifacts of a lifetime shared. Outside, the sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. He takes my hand, as he has taken it 1,000 times before. He says he is grateful for every day he has had with me. He thanks me for saving him, not just on that night when the machine failed, but every day since, by showing him how to live again. I lean my head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. I tell him the gratitude is mine. I say he gave me a reason to stop hiding, a reason to embrace who I truly am. I say that before him, I was only half alive, a shadow pretending to be a woman. He showed me what it meant to be seen, to be known, to be loved without condition. We sit together in the fading light, two people who found each other against all odds. And I think about the strange and winding path that brought us here. Every obstacle, every loss, every moment of fear and doubt was a step on the journey to this place, this life, this love. I spent 8 years burying a fire inside my chest, but on the night the Aether Duke's machine tore itself apart and I reached into the chaos without thinking, I did more than save 40 lives. I ignited the spark that would become the greatest adventure of my existence. I stepped out of the shadows and into the light, and I have never looked back. And if I had the chance to do it all again, knowing everything I know now, I would not change a single moment. Every scar, every triumph, every tear, they are all part of the tapestry of my life. They made me who I am. They led me to him. The fire burns on.